and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic, as you can see, is war and exclusion from 1910 to 1921, specifically focusing on the Mexican Revolution and World War I. Now, as always, before we start, take a minute, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and to their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off with the progressive era in America. And while this 19 teens period is going to overlap heavily with the progressive era, this is a whole topic in and of itself. Because during the 1910s, the United States is going to witness an immigration boom from Mexico as Mexicans begin moving into the United States in record numbers. Now, estimates show that about 10% of Mexico's total population is going to enter the United States during the 19 teens. This is an estimated 1.4 million people. And 80 to 90% of them were members of the working class. Now, yes, there's an economic draw, a pull factor to the United States. But the major reason why all these immigrants began crossing the border was less about the pull of the United States than it was the push factors of the Mexican Revolution. And that is something we need to talk about. So let's talk about the Mexican Revolution. So leading up to 1910, 1911, for the previous 31 years, between 1876 and 1911, the leader of Mexico was a man by the name of General Porfirio Diaz. And this era of Mexico history becomes known as the Porfiriato. Now, technically speaking, he was a president. He actually served 7 different terms during this 31-year span between 1876 and 1911. The longest stint was from 1884 all the way to 1911. In fact, by this point, both outsiders and many Mexicans themselves began to view Porfirio Diaz as an elected dictator. And this, of course, this era is known as a Porfiriato. Now, on the one hand, Diaz did try to modernize Mexico. He tried to develop it into a first world industrial nation, reminiscent of what was going on in the United States during the Gilded Age. He was very friendly to U.S. interests, especially U.S. investors. And he would often invite U.S. investors in to help develop Mexico for him, help him modernize Mexico. And there's some tremendous examples, including major Mexican industries, including petroleum, mining, railroads. And just to give you an example of railroads here, Porfirio Diaz employed U.S. investors to come and build railways to connect and modernize Mexico. But when they actually constructed the railroads, they were less about connecting Mexico to itself, east to west, than it was to connecting it north and south, connecting the resources of Mexico, including its people, to the United States. And this enabled U.S. investors, agribusiness, mining operations in the U.S. Southwest, to be able to more readily access all the riches and valuable resources of Mexico, whether it's iron ore or silver, or of course, workers, cheap, disposable laborers. The result of this, and again, you see the one on the screen, it's called the Mayan Train. This train is connecting the Mexico to the United States. The result is these major substantial industries that every nation needs. 80% of those industries were controlled by American business interests, with some kickbacks to Diaz himself. But at the same time, as this is going on, yes, it does theoretically, technologically speaking, modernize Mexico. But the benefit is not going to the average, everyday, working class Mexican person. The majority of the Mexican populace are still living as campesinos, land workers, field hands. They're living in extreme poverty, in segregation, in disenfranchisement, in being used as exploited, discriminated, incarcerated, impoverished labor, who is invisible to mainstream hierarchy of society. This is the situation in 1910, 1911, where the majority of your population is living in poverty at the expense of the rich 5% or 1%. And in 1910, 1911, revolution and warfare break out in the countryside, spreading to every corner of the Mexican nation. Now, the two main leaders that seem to emerge immediately is Francisco Villa, who will be the leader of the revolutionary forces in the north, and Emiliano Zapata, who will be the leader of the revolutionary forces in the south. The goal is very simple: to end the dictator rule of President Diaz, alleviate the suffering among the campesinos, and to nationalize industry. Now, yes, does this mean socialist government control? Yes. But it has to be done to get rid of foreign U.S. influence. Remember, U.S. is controlling 80% of these major industries. If you want to get rid of them, you have to use the government to nationalize them. Now, officially, the U.S. is going to be neutral here. Now, secretly, the United States is supporting the Diaz administration. He's viewed as an economic friend at best, a puppet at worst. But even though we remain officially neutral, we do insist upon protecting U.S. economic interests. We feared the violence would spread into the United States. We feared a surge of immigration from Mexico to the United States. But we also saw business owners taking tremendous advantage as individual warmongers, opportunists, would be engaged in gun running, in ammunition, smuggling it into Mexico to support the rebellion. Our response will be greatly influenced by U.S. CEOs. We will end up sending troops and weapons and supplies to help Diaz, and even assisted in trying to end the revolution because this was bad for American business. We have a lot of business capital, put into Mexico at this point. Unofficially, we were heavily involved. It was just part of our general policy. But the secret involvement should not be surprising. This was merely an evolution of traditional U.S. foreign policy. So I want to give you a quick, kind of oversimplified recap. U.S. foreign policy really began in 1823 by then President James Monroe. And he articulated what was called the Monroe Doctrine, whereby the United States would be the protector of the Western Hemisphere, more generally speaking, and specifically countries of Latin America, against European nations wishing to return or reclaim land they lost in the revolution. This is why we will support Mexico during their fight for independence against Spain. And this, for, again, most of the 19th century is our official policy. But all that changes after the Civil War, as the U.S. began its own empire-building mission under imperialism. We talked about this a little while back ago with the Spanish-American War. Because theoretically, the U.S. did help Cuba to liberate itself from the Spanish as part of the Monroe Doctrine. And while that is true, it was also us entering into a new phase of foreign policy. Because not only do we help liberate Cuba, we also inherited their Spanish colonial possessions. We would become a hegemonic force in the Caribbean basin. Puerto Rico becomes a U.S. colony. Cuba and Nicaragua are turned into virtual colonies. And we start to play a much larger role in South America. Now, in 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, he introduces two new things to the Monroe Doctrine. One is what he called the Roosevelt Corollary, which said that the U.S. has the right, the duty to intervene in the economic and political affairs of any country in the Western Hemisphere, and to determine the outcome of those affairs, especially if it was viewed detrimental to the United States. Let me repeat that. The U.S. has the right to intervene in the economic and political affairs of any country in the Western Hemisphere, and to possibly determine the outcome of those affairs if it's viewed as detrimental to the United States. This was no longer about foreign influence from Europe. This is about our political and economic interests. And so following the Spanish-American War, our policy changes. The Roosevelt Corollary is adding a new dimension where we are going to get involved, and we have the right to do so, we argue, if it benefits our economic and political interests. In addition, he embraced what was called big stick diplomacy. In other words, speak softly, but carry a big stick. Go to war if necessary. Take over land if that's what is needed. Do whatever is needed to benefit the United States at the expense of others. Now, big stick diplomacy worked. We got the Panama Canal out of it. And then things change in 1908 after Teddy Roosevelt leaves office, and his replacement is William Howard Taft, who embraces what's called dollar diplomacy. Now, in many ways, this is far more beneficial to the United States than big stick diplomacy was. So in 1908, William Howard Taft starts dollar diplomacy. The goal was to use money to make investments, loans, and trades, to influence nations of Latin America to the benefit of the United States. And this overlapped a period known as gunboat diplomacy, where we would send ships of money, but also guns, with the implication of if you don't negotiate and deal with what we want you to do, we will use our guns on you. So it sounds good to say dollar diplomacy, it's investments, foreign investment. It's a form of economic imperialism that we backed up with guns. And please understand, this is not one nation. Between 1912 and 1925, we're using this dollar diplomacy and gunboat diplomacy in Nicaragua. Between 1914 and 1934, we're doing this in Haiti. Between 1916 and 1924, we're doing this in the Dominican Republic. In Cuba, we were supposed to be protectors so they could be liberators and free themselves. We controlled them from 1917 to 1923 because they threatened our interests as an independent nation. We did this in Panama, controlling the Panama Canal that we just recently gave up control over. And of course, in Mexico, we are going to move in both 1914 and 1916. And this does not even account. So Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Panama, Mexico, this does not even account for this is just our official government actions. This is not taking into account things like private investment by people. And the thing is, this was an evolution of the capitalist system in the minds of most businessmen. General Smedley Butler, who headed most of these direct interventions to prevent government instability, wrote a memoir of his adventures in the 1930s, where he described himself. This is a military general being sent in by the U.S. to destabilize or prop up governments or to replace governments. He described himself as a racketeer for capitalism. Not a military general, not a global peacekeeper, not a harbinger of democracy. A racketeer of capitalism. And he says that he was a, quote, high-class muscle man for big business, unquote. He said, quote, I brought light to the Dominican Republic on behalf of the International Investment House of Browns Brothers Harriman in 1906. I then went for sugar interest in Haiti in 1914. Unquote. Understand this. We are sending the U.S. military to deal with governments that are hostile to us, not for necessarily political means, but to protect private investors. And again, this is very much in keeping with the times. When governments supported banks and private companies in their efforts to make money abroad. In fact, in the 1920s, U.S. investment in South America exceeded that of the British. And of course, we already talked about railroads in Mexico, right? During the Porfiriato, when nearly all of Mexico's major railway lines were built. They were built to take into account the interests of U.S. mining companies and raw material exporters. They were designed to link the raw materials of Mexico to the United States. Or take the story of William Walker, pictured here. This is dollar diplomacy in action. William Walker worked for Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, Cornelius Vanderbilt, if you don't know, was a major railroad tycoon in the United States who helped build Vanderbilt University later. William Walker was hired by Cornelius Vanderbilt, U.S. business tycoon, millionaire, to overthrow Sonora, Mexico. While at the same time, Vanderbilt himself was trying to convince the government to make the Gadsden Purchase, see picture on your screen, so that they could build a railroad across the region. Because the Gadsden Purchase, the area there, was part of Sonora. And they wanted to build a railroad, so Vanderbilt was negotiating with the U.S. government to convince them to negotiate with Mexico for the purchase of the Gadsden Purchase. At the same time, he sent William Walker to destabilize the local government and to actually overthrow it and take it over. It was this idea of oligarchy and wealth, how it maintains power, is very reminiscent of how the slave states controlled politics during the Mexican-American War that helped negotiate those borders, right? To change the borders from below Mexico City to where it is currently. Now, William Walker fails to take Sonora, but the Gadsden Purchase does go through him. Vanderbilt gets his railroad. Then, Vanderbilt wanted to build a canal in Nicaragua. But the Clayton Bulwark Tree prevented him from building the canal. So he hired Walker once again to take over Nicaragua. Walker succeeded this time. He overthrew the government. But then he reneged on his promise and he tried to re-enslave the Nicaraguans. When they resisted, they actually would kill him. But seriously, this guy was hired twice by an American businessman to destabilize and overthrow foreign governments. This is an example of the United States extending manifest destiny throughout Latin America, as well as an example of the power of big businessmen. And it will set a precedent for the poor U.S. Nicaraguan business relations that will resurface during the American occupation, the Somoza regime, the Sandinista revolution, and later in the 80s, this Iran-Contra affair. And you wonder why there's so many problems in Central America. We have a long history in the United States of destabilizing their governments. And all of this provided precedence then to the United States intervening more during the Mexican Revolution. So when the American Revolution breaks out, us going to intervene there is just common practice. So yeah, we're officially neutral, but we're going to be anything but neutral. So while dollar diplomacy did cause the flooding intervention into Latin America, the U.S. seemed to change courses in 1912 with the election of a new president, Woodrow Wilson. You see, the new president, Woodrow Wilson, fancied himself as a progressive. And in general, he supported the regulation of big business in the United States. And he would enact numerous policies, you see on the screen, to broaden democracy in the United States, including 4 constitutional amendments, including a graduated income tax, 16th, the direct election of senators, the 17th, prohibition, the 18th, and women's suffrage, 19th Amendment. He would help create the Federal Reserve Act to stabilize our economic banking system. He would help with the Clayton Antitrust Act to break up monopolies and create the FTC to help regulate the worst excesses of capitalism. But that was domestically. When it came to foreign policy, Woodrow Wilson wanted to be guided by what he called moral diplomacy. He wanted to use what he called moral diplomacy. He wanted American foreign policy to be guided by idealism rather than just national self-interest. He preached a message of harmony and cooperation. He believed it. But talking about it is much easier than actually doing it on the ground in the moment. And this is where we intersect now with the Mexican Revolution. And so bloody civil war is raging when Wilson takes office in March of 1913. By 1913, Mexico was now controlled by Victoriano Huerta, a ruthless general who was backed by the wealthy landowners and foreign investors, who had successfully overthrown Porfirio Diaz back in 1911. Wilson, however, under his guise of moral diplomacy, refuses to recognize Huerta and his, quote, government of butchers, unquote. He was trying to be guided by moral diplomacy. You see, when Wilson looked at Huerta, he sees a man who led a coup in 1913 over the last president, Francisco Madero, who had been elected in 1911, ending the Porfiriato. So, one more time. In 1911, Porfirio Diaz is ousted. Mexico elects a new leader by the name of Francisco Madero. He was the legally elected president. In 1913, Victoriano Huerta led a coup, jailed Madero, and then had him shot and murdered. Huerta was never elected, but yet declared himself president. And under moral diplomacy, despite the fact that Huerta had the backing of wealthy Mexican landowners and U.S. businessmen, Woodrow Wilson, trying something new for a change, refuses to recognize his leadership. Instead, Wilson was backing the rebel leader Venustiano Carranza, pictured center. Now, Carranza was fighting to create a new government of the people. And finally, growing discontent and rising numbers of enemies will cause Huerta to resign, and Carranza will form a new government. Woodrow Wilson will immediately recognize the new Carranza government. Despite this, Carranza was hostile to both Wilson and the United States. Years of the intervention, the Mexican-American War, dollar diplomacy, all at work. Carranza didn't trust the United States. Meanwhile, though, there's one more thing at play here, and that, of course, is Francisco Villa, better known as Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa had broken from Carranza and would lead a rebellion against the newly established Carranza government. In 1916, Villa turned against the United States as well because of Wilson's recognition of the Carranza government. So in January of 1916, Pancho Villa would abduct 18 U.S. citizens from a train in Mexico and kill them. The following week, he galloped into Columbus, New Mexico, crossing the border, killing 19 more and leaving the town in flames. So here we have a situation where we now have a elected leader of Mexico in Carranza who is recognized by the United States, but who doesn't like the United States. Pancho Villa is still fighting against the Carranza government as a rebel revolutionary force, now also hates the United States because they supported the Carranza government. And so in response to this, in January of 1916, Pancho Villa will kidnap, abduct 18 Americans from a train in Mexico and kill them. He will then cross the border into Columbus, New Mexico, killing 19 more and burning the town. So how does Woodrow Wilson now respond? How does moral diplomacy work now that Americans have been killed? Do you still do it by idealism? Or do you act more punitively? Again, moral diplomacy sounds good. It's harder in practice. And in response to these killings, Woodrow Wilson orders 6,000 U.S. troops into Mexico to capture Pancho Villa. Now, if you send troops into a foreign country uninvited, that is an act of war. What Wilson did was an act of war against Mexico. Now, you can argue Pancho Villa killed people. You're right, he did. But you can't send 6,000 troops into a foreign country and not expect a repercussion. Now, we got very lucky here because even though the Carranza government did not like Wilson, the Carranza government was new. It was very tenuous, and he would appear weak if he said basically, yeah, I didn't invite Wilson and the U.S. Army to come in. It would make him look weak in front of the Mexican people who is already not really trusting him. And so tacitly, Carranza said, oh yeah, I let him in to catch Pancho Villa. He killed people. So he did reluctantly support this invasion. For 2 freaking years, the United States military chased Pancho Villa all across the northern Mexican desert to no avail. Finally, after 2 years, the Carranza government would withdraw its consent for American troops, and Wilson would pull them home. But this episode would poison relations between the U.S. and Mexico for the next 30 years. This was seen as a disaster of U.S. foreign policy. And while the intervention did technically curb the power of both Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, other leaders would emerge and continue in their footsteps. And other revolutionaries would eventually take control of Mexico, who would nationalize the industries, who would exile American businessmen, and leading to a worse relationship between the two neighboring countries. The U.S. was trying to figure out how to prepare for a more major invasion of Mexico, but other matters caught their eyes. And that, of course, was World War I. So before we get to World War I, though, While Wilson had, under moral diplomacy, envisioned a more liberal democracy, in reality, it was just a new twisted way of unilateral U.S. military intervention in the region. Now, we're going to stop here, but when we come back, we're going to talk about, in the second half of the lecture, how this impacted U.S. Mexicanos. Because the war in Mexico, the Mexican War itself, the revolution, is going to dramatically impact U.S. Mexicanos. But until then, take care and bye-bye.